Well, welcome everybody. It's good to have you for today's webinar. The webinar today is on the Unstuck Church, why churches grow, thrive, decline, die. Oh, I hate to talk about that part. But we're going to dive into all of this, and I want to get there as quickly as possible to today's content. And so let me do some quick introductions for you, for the folks that are going to be joining us today. First of all, let me introduce you to my friend, Amy Anderson. Amy is the director of consulting here at the Unstuck Group, but in her previous life, she was the executive director of weekend services for Eagle Brook, and she spent, over 12 years in that role. During the season where Eagle Brook grew from over 3,000 to well over 20,000. So, Amy, it's great to have you in today's conversation. Oh, you're muted, but that's okay.
Thanks for having me. I'm here. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
It's good to be here.
And then also with us, Gabe Kolstad. Gabe is a ministry consultant for the Unstuck Group. He's also the lead pastor of Westside Community Church out in the Portland area. And gosh, there's a lot of exciting things happening in Gabe's church. Gabe, you're recently just reaching 1,000 in attendance in your 3 locations and lots of stories of life change happening. Gabe, it's good to have you in today's conversation as well.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you guys.
And then also working behind the scenes, because we want to take your questions today, and we're going to try to address as many of those questions as possible. So working behind the scenes is my friend Mark Meyer. Mark and I have known each other for, more than a decade. He helps us help churches take their next steps, and he's going to be helping to moderate in the Q&A section. And if you want to submit your questions, scroll down to the bottom of this window, and there's a icon there for you to submit your questions, and we'll take some time at the end for you to, well, hopefully, like I said, we'll address as many of those questions as we can. But if you want to participate in the conversation using social media, if you like the Twitter and the Facebook, use hashtag UnstuckChurch, and you can join the conversation that way. Like I said, today it's all about the Unstuck Church, and boy, it's been encouraging to see number of people that have taken advantage of getting a copy of the new book that just came out earlier this week. It's the first book that I've published like this in over 8 years. So it's been fun to watch the traction that's getting. But that's where the focus of today's conversation is, and it's going to begin about this key question: where are we in the life cycle as a church? And we're going to unpack what that life cycle looks like. But here's the deal. I've been praying for you. You may not want me to have been praying this prayer actually, but I've been praying that God will interrupt us today. I've been praying that for you. I've been praying that for me. And the reason why I know is this: interruptions, they jolt us. Interruptions challenge us to pause and assess what's happening in our lives, in our ministry, and our leadership. And then when we pause, we reflect on where are we today and where is God calling us to go next? What does that next step look like? When we do that, I know this: we have to plan. We have to plan for that next step. And then we actually have to take it. We have to act on it. And you'll probably hear that theme over and over in the conversation today. God, interrupt us, help us to assess where we are, help us to consider what our next steps look like, and then give us the courage to act. Today, we're going to dig into a few different things. Where are growing churches typically getting stuck as they move towards sustained health? What does sustained health really look like? And then finally, what are some early warning signs that we've entered the maintenance season, that we've started to see plateau, decline, and begin to head down the life cycle? So we're going to dive in. And Amy, I'm just going to turn it over to you to lead this next portion of our conversation.
Sure. Well, maybe, Tony, you could just start by giving us a brief intro to the life cycle. And as you do, maybe share with us what a church would be focusing on, during each of those different phases.
Yeah, so There, in the book, we map out 7 different phases of the life cycle. We're going to go into it a lot more detail in the book, but let me give you a quick overview of those 7 phases. It begins with launch. And in the launch season, boy, this is a fun season for the church because everything is new. It's a new season. We're trying to do a new work, and we're trying to reach new people. And that's really the focus in this early season is let's reach as many new people as we can. And because it's all brand new, not many people, not many resources, primary focus is about a great weekend service. So that's the launch season. Then the next step up the life cycle is into momentum growth. And here the key is we're making space for new people, for people to connect in new ministry, and we're connecting new people to the church. And I've been in this season with a couple of different churches talking about fun. I mean, it's almost like every time the church opens its doors, new people are showing up, and there's a lot of momentum. That's why we call that the momentum growth phase of the church. Then we move up the life cycle to the strategic growth stage. And the challenge here is the momentum won't carry us further toward sustained health. We actually have to establish new systems and new strategies to continue to see health and growth as a church. And so the key distinction here, the church is beginning to establish healthy strategies and systems. Finally, at the pinnacle of the life cycle is sustained health. And here in sustained health, it's a healthy church, it's a growing church. And what really distinguishes these churches is that they're really reproducing at all levels. So we're seeing new disciples being made, we're seeing new leaders developed, we're seeing new groups, new ministry launching, we're seeing the church reproduce itself in multiple services or multiple campuses or church planting. The ministry of the church is continuing to expand, it's continuing to grow, and we're continuing to reach more people. It's almost a multiplication that's happening by this point. Unfortunately, though, not all churches stay at sustained health, and we begin to see churches plateau or decline. Sometimes that's happening before they even realize it's happening. And that leads us to the maintenance phase of the life cycle. And maintenance, really the key here is we're at this point really just trying to maintain who we are. This is where traditions begin to take root. Where unfortunately the focus becomes more on the people who are already connected to the church than the people that outside the church and outside the faith. Next step down the life cycle then is preservation. And by this point, we're starting to recognize not only are we losing money, but we're losing people. And we're just trying to keep the people that we already have. This is where, unfortunately, we hear a lot of times, what do the bylaws say? What does the Constitution say? We're trying to follow the rules rather than fulfill the mission that God's called us to. And then finally, we reach life support. And by this point, we're really just, it's not trying to reach new people. We're just trying to keep the doors of the church open. And the reality is, by the time a church gets there, it's going to probably take a completely new launch before they're able to experience sustained health again. So, Amy, that's a quick overview of the 7 phases of the life cycle of a church that we cover in the Unstuck Church.
It's great. Gabe, it seems like you have something you want to ask.
Yeah, Tony, do you think that all churches go through every phase of the life cycle that you just described? Do you think every church is going to go through those?
Yeah, well, I should probably be turning that question around to you, Gabe, because you're a church planter. I mean, you've seen a lot of churches get started, and I think you would acknowledge not every church goes from that launch stage into momentum growth, strategic growth, and eventually experiencing sustained health. There are instances where something launches and it almost goes straight over to the right side of the life cycle where it's in maintenance or preservation mode pretty quickly. And so I don't think necessarily every church, or by the way, every ministry. That's something to consider too, because every ministry has a life cycle. I don't know that every church or every ministry goes through all 7 phases. Some of them have a launch and then they're moving to the right side.
And then, if a church goes through a plateau or decline, if a church starts flattening out, is that an indication that they've entered the maintenance phase?
Yeah, not necessarily. And the reason I say that is because there's this biblical principle of pruning. In fact, we see probably not only in our own lives, but certainly in the churches that we're leading, that sometimes pulling back, kind of cutting off even healthy branches produce more fruit in the long run. And so it could be that a plateau that we're experiencing, or even a decline, if ultimately it's going to help us move forward and see more fruit in our ministry, it could be that we're just going through a season of pruning. Now, here are a couple of distinguishing factors to help us discern: is this really a season of pruning, or have we entered a maintenance season, or are we in a preservation phase of the life cycle? A couple key things. Number one, when we prune, it's usually intentional. And so it's intentionally us looking at either branches that are dead or healthy branches that we're intentionally cutting off, so that we can produce more fruit in the plant. In our case, more fruit in the church. And so if it's intentional, that may be an indication that it's pruning. The other thing I would say is, if it could be pruning, but if it goes from months of plateau and decline to years, if it extends, then we've probably moved from what we may have considered a season of pruning into what really is a maintenance season, or we've entered preservation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, Tony, where do most churches get stuck? When they're trying to live in sustained health, where do you find that they get stuck?
Yeah, so it's there are actually a couple of phases, Amy. One is when churches are growing through the life cycle, and it's in that strategic growth season that we commonly see churches getting stuck. And I think part of this goes back to launch and momentum growth. Many times, as churches are growing through those first 2 seasons, first of all, that entrepreneurial thing in a church planter or a lead pastor that loves to start things and then help build things, it's just fueling everything in them that it plays into those natural entrepreneurial strengths. When we get to a place, though, where the momentum starts to slow, the next place we have to go as a ministry is where we're establishing new strategies and new systems to maintain health, to help people take their next steps toward Christ and discipleship, to connect more people to the church and serving and in groups, to begin to replicate too, even simple things like new people connecting to the church. How do we help people take their first steps at a church? As churches grow out of necessity, because we're connecting more people, we have to establish strategies and systems to allow for that to happen on a more consistent basis. And so that takes a different type of leadership to do that. And I think many leaders, they're just not prepared for, or sometimes not willing to take that next step in their leadership to move from momentum growth to strategic growth. On the other hand, the other area where we see churches getting stuck is on that first step after sustained health, where plateau or maybe decline has started. And the challenge here I mentioned earlier is many times we don't even realize we've taken that step. And part of what compounds the challenge here is what we've seen is sometimes when it comes to giving, this is the healthiest season of giving that we see in some churches. And it's because there's this giving lag that happens. We notice it more often when the church is brand new and they're moving up the life cycle and new people are coming, but new people haven't started to give yet. There's a giving lag that happens there. Well, that giving lag carries over to the right side of the life cycle as well. In other words, attendance may plateau or decline, but the giving's going to stay strong because it's people that are connected to the faith, they're connected to the church, they're generous, they're being good stewards of the resources God's given them. So the giving's still strong. The challenge is the church has begun to turn inward and they're not reaching as many new people. And so sometimes the giving patterns and the financial health of the church can really cover up what may be that first step that's already taken into the maintenance phase of the life cycle.
It's good. One of the things, Tony, that we talked about is when a church is in that strategic growth phase, what are some of the core issues they need to address so that they can keep moving uphill towards sustained health and don't get stuck? And just playing that back a little bit, one of the themes that, and maybe you can comment on that too, one of the key things that I see is important during that phase is that churches really start to make sure that they have leaders of leaders on staff. And what I mean by that is through that whole first right side of the growth curve, often you've got a lot of people that have been on your team for a long time that have caught this wave of momentum. They've, they're there, they're in it with you, they're building it, and you get to a place where all of a sudden you need a new structure. And people maybe who have been doing great things for a long time, they're great because they're great at what they do. But all of a sudden, I see churches hit this place where they need to have more leaders in place who can, in a sense, conduct the ministry than do the ministry. I don't know, maybe you can comment on that a little bit. What do you see on that structure side?
Yeah, so it's unique. There are different challenges along the way on the types of leaders that we bring around us, and it's interesting. The churches that dip from sustained health into the maintenance season, a lot of times what we're seeing is they've followed all the advice, and it's great advice of we need to hire from within. We need to bring people from within the church and help them step into leadership roles. And that's a great thing because those folks, they love Jesus, they love the church, their general wiring and how they approach situations. The challenge is, though, when you always hire from within, you lose that infusion of outside perspective and that kind of thinking and challenge that it brings to the church, to the organization, to help us look beyond ourselves and consider the shifts that are happening, not only in the communities that we're trying to reach, but in our church ministry itself. And a lot of times for those churches that have dipped into maintenance season, it's counterintuitive, but you may need to bring some outside voices into the team. The other thing is we find is many times people have elevated into roles that they're very good when it comes to maintaining stability. They're great with systems. They know how to build systems and make sure we follow through with the systems. But if you've dipped into this maintenance season of the church, one of the things you have to do is start to acknowledge we need to go back to the mission has to be a higher priority than the methods and the systems that we're using. We need to get the mission in front of us. And instead, a lot of times at this point, we begin to worship the methods that we're using, the way we do church, rather than why we do church. And again, sometimes we need that infusion from the outside to help us regain that vision, really the call that God's given us as a church to reach people outside the church and outside the faith.
Well, and one thing, I know when you work with churches and you help them get back to their mission, why they exist and their vision, where they're going, and you help them determine strategies. I know that's a key part of what we do. I often follow you into staffing and structure.
Yes.
Following that. And one of the ways that we talk about it, we often see stuck churches actually kind of look at their people first. And then they look at, now with these people, how should we get structured? And now what can we accomplish? And what I find for churches that really keep moving towards that sustained health, they do it the opposite. They start by going, what are the key things that God's asking us to do in this season? Now, how do we need to be structured in order to do that? And now who are the people that need to fill those roles in order for us to stay here?
That's
because
right.
being and organizing a church at 300 is different than 800, which is different at 2000. And if you throw multi-site in there, of course, you've got to hold loosely to that structure because it needs to serve your strategies and what you're trying to accomplish.
That's right. Yeah, form follows function, and so we need to determine what's the vision for where God's calling us to go. What's the strategy on how we're going to see that vision accomplished, and then we need to look at how do we structure to see that happen, and making sure we have the right people and the right roles to carry out that vision and strategy.
Yep.
Tony, when we're thinking about this curve and how, all of us probably hope we never tip over the corner, to the phase. But if that was happening, what would be some of the early warning signs that we might be able to figure out, okay, that must mean that we're headed that direction?
Yeah, the two key things, one I've mentioned already is, and it's not, we don't do this intentionally as churches, because every one of us wants to see more people become Christ followers, to have that vibrant relationship with Jesus. And as a result of that, for our churches to be healthy and growing and thriving, every one of us wants that. But unintentionally, we always drift back to really focusing on the people that are already inside our churches, the people that are connected to our churches. In fact, I heard Andy Stanley say it at the Drive Conference at North Point Church just a couple of weeks ago. He just acknowledged again, the gravitational pull is always toward the inside. And so it's somehow, if we're going to get back to sustained health, we need to make that the priority again. And I'm not saying everything we do all the time for every person is always focused on the person outside the church. I want to reach people, but I also want to disciple people and help them become disciple makers too. And so there needs to be some healthy balance. It's not going to be equal of the things we do as a church to reach people outside the faith and the things we do as churches that help people take their next steps toward Christ as well. But somehow we have to regain that. I'll tell you what, though, Gabe, the second thing that we need to be looking for, though, is complexity. And complexity comes in different forms. For some churches, it's complexity around decision-making and how they're structured, their governance model. Over time, we add levels of complexity, and it just gets harder for churches to make decisions. So that's one level. But the other level of complexity that we see commonly in churches that have stepped into this maintenance season is, through the years, they've just continued to add more and more and more good ministry programming, but it ends up being a very complex ministry strategy then as a result of that. And churches that move down this path, it ultimately they're trying to maintain all of these programs rather than really thinking about a person comes to our church here in their faith journey. We're helping that. We want to help them take next steps toward becoming a fully devoted follower of Christ. Are we really creating a path to help people do that? And that's the other key thing we need to be looking for churches that hit this season, and kind of gives that first indicator is our ministry model just too complex? We've made it actually more difficult by continuing to add layers and layers of ministry programming to what we're offering to the folks that are connected to our churches.
It's good.
Gabe, I'm supposed to flip around a question here for you, aren't I? Let's see. Can you talk a little bit about how a church has, when they've gotten stuck in maintenance, from your perspective, what can help them start to move back towards that position of sustained health?
Yeah, I think it's really hard work. I think first of all, I think it requires a certain amount of commitment and courage, just relationally and in general. But I think one of the things that really is that turn back, at least we've seen in our church, and I think as we've gone through the cycles and then watching lots of other churches, I think it's about getting that focus back on those outside the faith and outside the church. If I only had one word I could use to describe what I think has helped in our case, and as many as I can observe, is just the word stories. It just seems like the more we tell stories about what God is doing in bringing people in and building them up, that really kind of focuses our energy. And I love the idea that we can look at what's working well and how can we do more of that, as opposed to, how do we fix everything that's broken? Because there's just so much energy that goes out in this phase when you're trying to figure it out. I love the thought about making things less complex, and how over time churches tend toward complexity. Everything does, and churches for sure. I think one of the big ones in this whole deal is just to clarify the why. Just asking that question: why are we here? What's the vision? What's the purpose for the ministry? And of course, the idea that some things have outlived their their life cycle, but people still hold dearly to them in the church. And so it's kind of, I think it's helping people release their grip on things. And maybe part of the trick, in my experience, is that we shouldn't take something away without introducing something new, or at least refocusing that energy. People are very emotionally and spiritually attached to the ways we've expressed our faith. And so sometimes, when we just dismantle without repositioning things that are the new wineskin in a sense, then it's very unhelpful. But I think in keeping that energy moving forward, telling those stories, keeping it simple, focusing on the why, those to me are the greatest indicator, the greatest things we can do to start moving back up.
Yeah, it's a dangerous spot when we are so focused on what ministry we do, we forget why we're doing the ministry, isn't it, Gabe?
Yeah, that's a tough place.
So Amy, before we move on to this third section, you've been working with one or two churches that they actually have started to move down the right side of the life cycle, maintenance, preservation. And what's been an encouragement to me is some of the leaders that you've walked alongside as they're trying to either start launch a completely new life cycle for the church, or at the very least try to pull back towards that season of sustained health. What have you seen in those leaders, Amy, that have really allowed them to take some healthy steps forward for not only their personal leadership, but the ministry of the church as a whole?
Yeah, they're amazing, first of all. To work with a church who's on the right side of that thing, either in maintenance or preservation. What's really distinguished the couple of churches I'm working with right now is that when they saw it, they genuinely, like, soul-filled, were struck by it when they became aware of it. They knew there were some problems before, but once they really realized, boy, if we keep doing this, if we keep doing what we've been doing, we will die, and this church won't exist anymore. And to quote one of them, the pastor said, "I don't want to pastor a hospice church. I don't want to pastor this church to death. Something's got to change." And these leaders, they really looked inside themselves to say, boy, it starts with us. So a lot of courage. I think that's the word I would give you, Tony, is just courage tied with faith, knowing that God's in it with them, but really a step back. And they got back to the foundation of, why does our church exist? And, we care about the people in this church. We care about the kids of the people in our church, but we care about those kids' friends and those young families that are moving into our communities. And if we don't reach them, who will? And so courage is a huge thing. It's going to take a lot of work, but it's not just the pastors who are doing it. They've got some great people around them, I think, that God's brought to with that same courage. And we're the people who have been called to turn this thing and get us, in our language, back to the left side of reaching people and discipling people in our community.
That's encouraging. That's very encouraging. All right, so that brings us to, we've talked about kind of the left cycle, the fun part of the life cycle of the church, where we're seeing increase in the number of people churches are reaching, and the discipleship process that's happening in churches. Churches are growing in health and numbers. And we've talked about the right side, where there's plateau and there's decline. But that leaves us with the pinnacle of the life cycle, and that's this area of sustained health. And I want to unpack a little bit of what that looks like. But boy, this is my prayer for churches. I want churches to be here, to live here, to stay here. That's why it's called sustained health. And the great news is we're seeing a number of churches, they're at this very place. You probably get to hear the stories coming from some of these churches. We get to see the stories of churches firsthand at the Unstuck group that you probably have never heard of, but that are living in the season of sustained health. So, Amy, I'm looking forward to unpacking this a little bit.
Well, yeah, I think the first question, Tony, is just what do churches look like when they've hit this place? If this is the destination where we want to be, what are some of those qualities or characteristics that you see when a church has reached sustained health?
Yeah. So let me share a few things. Some of them are going to be more obvious than others, but as I began to look at the different churches that we're currently working with or have served in the past that are in this season of sustained health,
Mm-hmm.
some of the characteristics of either the leaders or the churches themselves include this. Well, the first thing is it's interesting. They've really maintained through the years, even through that season of strategic growth where there's more systems, it feels like there's going to be more structure in place. They've really maintained a collaborative approach to how they look at ministry, so it's not just on the shoulders of one person, it's very collaborative. And then the other thing is they're still willing to take calculated risks, and maybe that it's the two words together, calculated but risks. It's kind of prioritizing the right bold moves that we need to continue to make so that we can reach a constantly shifting culture and communities around us. The church constantly has to be changing in order to reach a changing culture. Now, of course, the truth of what we offer, the hope in Jesus, it's not going to shift, but the way we do church, it's constantly going to have to shift. And that's one of the keys that helps a church stay in sustained health rather than dipping into that maintenance season or even further into preservation, is they don't worship their methods. They'll leverage their methods as long as they can to reach as many new people as they can for Jesus and to help people take next steps. But they don't hold on to that just because they've always done it that way. They're still willing to take those calculated risks. There's also this balance between needing to refresh the vision, but also continue to further develop healthy systems. They go hand in hand. And the visionaries that are probably listening are thinking, I don't want to hear anything about systems. Don't tell me about strategy, because I have a vision for a new place that I want to go. And then there are others on this webinar today that are saying, I'm tired of the visionary coming into my office and telling me about the new place that we're going to go. We're still trying to figure out how to implement great strategies and systems around the last idea that we had. And so the win here is finding that healthy balance. And there are some of us, we need the pull of the visionaries around us to keep us moving forward. And then there are some of us, those visionaries, we need the pull of the people that are more systems minded, more process thinkers, because they're the ones that are going to actually help us see that vision get accomplished. But at the end of the day, here's the key thing. There are more and more and more people becoming Christ followers. And the way we've seen that health, that sustained health happen, is that we can't just reach new believers and call that the win. We have to reach new believers and then help those believers eventually become disciple makers themselves. And because of that, there's this reproducing that's happening. Like I said, it's disciples reproducing other disciples. It's leaders reproducing other leaders. It's groups continuing to multiply. It's churches continuing to multiply, either through added services or new campuses or church planting. And it almost shifts from being a church to a movement at that point. And we're seeing a number of churches that are taking that step. And it's a great thing. And I'm celebrating because we're seeing healthy churches continue to have a broadening impact on communities and ultimately regions, nations, and the world. So that's a picture of, I think, of what sustained health looks like.
Can I add one thing in there because I was on the staffing and structure piece of it, but
sure.
As you talked about this tension between vision and systems, it also goes back to, I think, a staff. When you're in sustained health, you've got a staff that has a good mix of giftings.
That's true.
I think we know that like in our head, but I see a lot of churches we tend to hire and have people around us who are a lot like us, who are wired just like us. And there's
Yes.
always that odd man out in the room who seems to be wired differently. Like, when they inhale at a meeting, you kind of roll your eyes because you know what they're going to say. Well, that's that one person trying to hold down one or the other side of that, those dimensions. And so sustained health, it's reached with teams that have different gift mixes that can bring different viewpoints so that you can have overall health with a larger and a growing organization.
Yeah, there's a reason why we read about the whole body of Christ in Scripture, isn't it? We need all of those giftings and wirings. And I'll just say generally, Amy, what we see in churches is a good thing. But church, if we were to look at people that are more mission-minded and people that are more relationally minded, churches tend to get a lot of relationally minded people in staff teams and leadership roles. And again, that's a good thing. But if we're going to be a reflection of a healthy body, we also need some people on our teams that kind of can balance that out by keeping the mission first too.
Yeah.
And we need both. But churches tend to have a gap when it comes to the more mission-wired people on our teams, and we need that gifting for the church to be healthy. So, Gabe, I personally think you're leading a church right now in sustained health, and you've worked with churches. What are some of the things you're seeing in churches that are in this phase that kind of set them apart?
Yeah, well, let me also just reiterate that how much I appreciate what you guys were just talking about with the balance of giftedness. And I keep laughing every time you talk about the visionary versus the strategist, because there's just so many conversations in our church about that. So it's close to home, but it's so true that we got to have that balance. I think one of the things that I see is that there's this, I don't know if I wouldn't call it plodding growth necessarily, but there's just constant growth over time, and it's the reflection of health, that there's life, and if something's alive and it's healthy, then it is growing. If it's alive and it's not healthy, then it's dying. And so we're seeing this kind of all the time new life popping up. I think one of the things that we see is there's a passion for unity in churches with sustained health, because we all know how quickly disunity can destroy momentum in a church, can take things over the edge toward death. And I think what I see is a drive for unity in very specific things, like the vision, unity in the vision, which again, so difficult to if you were to rate your own organization, we'd all probably say, I don't know, but there's got to be unity in vision. There's got to be unity in mission. Like what are we doing? And when the real deal is, what's the calendar? What are we going to calendar? And does that align with our mission? In values, how are we making decisions? And just driving unity, all those things. I think even in doctrine, one thing that I think it maybe could be a really practical way to look at this is that churches in sustained health seem to have developed a set of healthy standards they're going to hold their leadership teams to. And so they're saying, here's what we're about, and we're going to hold our leadership teams to that. Anyway, a couple other things is we see people, churches in this place, they're innovating. They're doing new things. They're trying new ideas, taking risks, experimenting with something new, and that can be really tricky. We don't want to bet the farm on it, but we want to make sure that there's new things being tried. And perhaps one question to ask that I think churches in sustained health are doing this is they're reorganizing the team for the current and coming season. And one great question might be, when's the last time we reorganized our staff? Just because those things can really hold us back, but that sustained health is there. And then financially, here's probably one of the biggest difference makers is that churches in sustained health are using wise financial planning. I mean, they have margin. And so they've developed the discipline and the rhythm of how do we have margin and how do we be healthy, rather than relying on hope as a strategy financially, because that just could really, again, tip it right over the curve quite quickly if we run out of money.
Yeah, that's not a good thing.
Gabe, it's just funny that you were talking about the distinction between the visionary and the strategist, because you're one of those rare birds that can actually live in both worlds. And I wish I was one of you, but you were gifted with both of those areas. I don't know how that happened. It's really not fair.
One of the things that I'm noticing more over time is funny is that as I've brought team members on who I lean toward vision, and I do strategy when necessary. And so when I've got team members now that I'm leaning more and more into vision, and I'm noticing that the strategic side of things, I'm so glad I have help for that.
That's good. That's good.
So Tony, we talked through some of the different phases, but how can a church confirm what phase their church is in?
All right. Well, Amy, that leads us to the next step. And so here are a couple things that I want to strongly encourage everybody that's watching today to do. The first is completely free. And so you ought to take advantage of this. It's the Unstuck Church Assessment. And we actually offer a couple of versions. One, you can do individually, just kind of assess based on your opinion where you think your church is. But there's a version of the tool that you can invite your team to do this with you. And I think you'll find that the results will be stronger. It's going to be a more accurate assessment the more people that you include in that assessment. Good news is it's free, so you'll be able to check that out. Secondly, really, you ought to pick up the book, The Unstuck Church. And it's not free, but it's only $10. So I think we can afford that. Let me just say the Morgan College Fund will appreciate that too. But the Unstuck Church, that's what we do in the book, is we unpack in a great level of detail, far beyond what we could do in this 45-minute webinar today. What does every phase of the church look like? But more importantly, what we also offer in the book then are what are the practical next steps that we can take once we determine what phase the church is in. And that's the stuff that I get most excited about, because basically there's a next step for every church out there. And I just want to encourage you to be focusing in those areas where it's going to have the greatest impact on your church, because this is the season your church is in. So don't try to do things that could be good, that could be healthy for any church. Do the things that are the right next steps for where your church is today. So, by the way, all of that you can find at the unstuckchurch.com, theunstuckchurch.com, and we'll make sure to email you more details after the webinar. But this brings us to the fun part of the webinar. Amy and Gabe, it's not like the last 45 minutes were fun, but we're going to go to Q&A, and so I hope we don't catch each other off guard here. But I have the questions in front of me, so I'm going to be the question asker. And if you're savvy, you'll turn the question around on me, but I'm going to start asking the questions for you first. Amy, we talked about some churches that you're working with they're kind of in this turnaround season. Mm-hmm. They've either landed in the maintenance season or preservation season, and they're trying to turn things around and start a new life cycle. And the question is, how long is that going to take?
Well, what would you think, Tony? How long do you think?
You're good at that.
Well played, Amy.
Thank you.
No, you first.
Okay. Well, the timing is definitely an issue. You've got to move with wisdom through the changes. And so it's this tension between, you don't want to move so fast that nobody comes with you. And you don't want to make so many changes that people don't have solid ground, but you don't want to move so slow that you're really just trying to do a temperature check every time you take a step or two. So I would say it's probably going to take, 2 years. 2 years to where they're going to be into this new rhythm. You know, a couple of them have structure issues from a congregational to a staff-led type of things they're working through. That's going to take a little bit. That's where I'd say it's probably on that 2-year plan with regular change happening, but they've got to get through that first. For a church that's already structured correctly, it's probably on the shorter end of that, in the 1 to 2 year range.
Yeah, I was going to respond. It's not weeks or months, but years here.
Yeah.
And the other contribution I would make as a response to that question is this: it needs to be as long as it takes for the church to get back to why do we exist? What has God called us to do? And to get everybody on board with the why first. And then we can start to talk about the tactical changes that we might need to make in order to move forward from there. But you need to take as long as you need to take to make sure everybody's on board with the why first, and there's complete alignment there. We want unity among the believers. And it's easier to get unity about the why first than if we were to just jump into just making changes in methods and how we do church. So that's how I would respond to that. All right, Gabe, we're a congregational-led church. What resources would you recommend or steps to take to change the model without blowing up the church?
Oh, that's a good question. Thanks for asking that, Tony. I think, to me, the word trust just keeps running around in my head as we talk about all this, is that's probably the most important thing, is we have to build trust. And that means that we have to be trustworthy. And I think that means, going down to the nitty gritty of, do I do what I say? I mean, that really determines whether somebody's going to trust me or not. So I'd work on that first, is do I do what I say? Am I trustworthy? Because then, do I have solid relationships? All of this stuff goes way faster with solid relationships and trust, and way slower without it. Resources I would recommend might be, honestly, for me, I like looking outside of the church world to the business world, because I think I see so much more concrete examples sometimes of how things can work. So look at a business turnaround, look at the story of a business that has gone through, back up the curve, and try to make some parallels from that. That's been more helpful for me. What was the second part of that question, Tony?
Good question. We'll stop there, but let me give you a different question that may be easier, Gabe, because this question came in too. Gabe talked about telling stories. Do you remember when you said that?
I did, yeah.
All right. And so can you elaborate a little bit more on the platforms where you see churches effectively sharing stories?
Oh, way easier question. Okay. Whoever that is, I like that question. Yeah, I mean, definitely on stage during a message is the most powerful time we've found. I think working somebody's, and it could be little simple things like you could just talk about somebody has started reading the Bible for the first time and put their picture up on the screen and say, we're so proud of these people. I mean, it can take a minute. That's one way. An email to a team, is one place to do it, to a staff team, to a volunteer team, to an elder team, just emails that say, hey, by the way, did you hear last weekend this happened? One example would be at our church, we recently had some really neat things happening. And one particular story, this girl came in who just had never been to a church service before. And all of these neat things happened related to that. So we got to the next week follow up with our hospitality team in the huddle on Sunday morning, 30 minutes before the service starts, and just go, guess what? You guys are making the world of difference, because this woman felt welcome because of you guys. Little stories like that. I think the question is, where do we want to go, and what are the living examples of that right now? And so just shining the light on those bright spots. That's what I meant by stories. And I would do that in any possible way. Record it, send it out in audio, every possible way.
Yeah. All right, Amy, you're going to eventually get this question, but I'm going to be a nice guy and respond first, okay? The question is, at what point during the life cycle is it best for a church to consider going multi-site or planting new locations? And the follow-up is, and does going multi-site or planting generate momentum and recover from the decline side of the life cycle chart? So here's the basic principle that we're seeing with churches that are embracing multi-site strategy. It's you replicate who you are. And so if your church is healthy, multi-site will help you extend the healthiness of your church faster. That's a good thing. But what we have also seen is if your church is not healthy, multi-site will help you extend the unhealthiness, is that a word? The unhealthiness of your ministry faster as well. And you'll feel it faster, let me tell you that. So if there are optimal times in the life cycle, I would say it's somewhere in that strategic growth stage, because at that point, you're not just growing through momentum, there's some intentional things that you're doing as a church to maintain health and growth. And you want that intentionality to be in place in one location before you try to replicate that in multiple locations. Amy, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think what you said is great. Maybe I would add, You want to go multi-site because you have to. We were just with the multi-site coaching network and we had a long conversation about that. You want to go multi-site because you have to. Multi-site is not a growth strategy. Multi-site is an evangelism strategy. And it takes a lot of resource, both literal resource and time and people and all of that. And you've got to launch from a place of momentum and resource to be able to do that. So that's only a little bit that I'd add.
That's good. All right, Gabe, I'm going to come back to you because it's specifically about lead pastors, but it's not a lead pastor asking the question. But you are a lead pastor, so I'll be intrigued to hear your response to this. Here's the question. How do you help the lead pastor or a lead team become aware of health issues in the church if you don't have a seat at the table?
Oh, that's a great question. I will tell you that I'm most receptive when I know somebody is genuinely concerned about the health of the church and not promoting their own agenda. Because I think the thing that's hard about being in the lead seat at a church is that you realize you have responsibility to Jesus for the overall health and growth of the church and for what it contributes to his kingdom. And you also realize that there are, there's always going to be these little slices, right? And so people have their ownership in those areas. That's good. But when I know somebody's coming with a big picture health of the church in mind, in other words, they'd be happy even if their little program or their idea didn't get used as long as the church was winning. That's when I'm most receptive. I get a little bit defensive if somebody's coming in going, hey, we got to do this thing. And, but I'm going, yeah, but you don't understand how that impacts the rest of the church. So when there's that openness there, so, I would say direct is best, go right to the team, go right to the person that you need to talk to. Worst case scenario is you share it with somebody else and they find out that you were unhappy, or that you had something you wanted to talk about and never did. Every leader appreciates direct communication. And I know it's not easy, but make that appointment, make your notes, make an appointment that you can keep the time frames. If it's 30 minutes, make it 30 minutes. If it's 45, make it 45, honor the time, but say what you need to say. And be honest and be sincere. I think that's the best way to do it.
Yeah, and if you feel like you don't have enough trust to engage that conversation, you probably are at the wrong place then, right?
Could be.
Yeah. All right. So here's another question. What type of loss have you seen in people and finances in churches that make these bold changes? How far back have they gone before going forward? And it's interesting that we get that question because I've had conversations with two different churches. Both of them are they're on the left side of the life cycle, seeing growth, seeing health, if not at sustained health now. Just incredible increase that's happened in both of these churches, both in the last couple of weeks. And both churches told me that they lost a third of their people and a third of their finances before making these transitions that led to the church getting unstuck and eventually experiencing health again. And so when Amy talked earlier about having courage, that's probably what she had in mind, is if you're willing to do what it takes for the church to become healthy again and ultimately see the growth and see the increase, it's very likely going to mean you're going to have to make some tough changes. And those changes initially are going to lead to some decline before you see some increase. And it's going to be different for every church. Some churches, I have seen some churches that the circumstances were such, the leadership was such that it was barely noticeable that the church made any significant shift in methodology or approach, but ultimately moved from the right side, the decline, to the increase of the left side of the life cycle. But in most cases, there's going to be some decline before you move forward. And again, I think that's the picture of the pruning that we see in the churches that we're serving, and certainly, again, part of the biblical approach that we see to pruning as well. Amy, do you have anything else you want to add on that question?
I would just guess the further you are down the right side of the life cycle, the more loss you'll have before you turn it around.
That's a good word too.
With what you're saying is, in every church I've seen that makes these changes, they do lose, and then God replaces with even more.
All right. So, Gabe, You're certainly not at this place because your church, again, it's thriving. But if you're a pastor and there comes a point where, is there ever a point, is the question here, where you simply need to pick up your sandals and move on to another church? What are your thoughts on that as someone that's in that senior pastor role?
Yeah, I guess it really all goes back to calling. I mean, I could tell you there's been many times I've thought about it, even though we now we're in a sustained health place, but there's always struggles. I think the question would be, what is God asking me to do? And I think there are times, I think if you're not in a place where philosophically what your heart of hearts wants to do is going to be received by either the church or the elders or whatever the leadership structure is, and that, then I think that would be, for me, that would be my clue to say, I'm not going to waste my life here. I'm not going to waste energy doing some ministry in a way where I'm muzzled from what I'm feeling that God has put in my heart. I just wouldn't do it. So I would move on in that case. I think a lot of it is the idea that the leader needs to match the church, needs to match the community. And when that's in, if the strengths and the kind of personality of the leader matches the church and matches the community, that's a great recipe. If you see that's completely off, it might be time to consider, is God calling me into something that's a better fit? I think those are, so it's, it's really about fit and then alignment, I think, with the church and the philosophy of ministry. If it's moldable and you can shape it, do that. I'd stick as long as I could, as long as I knew I was making a difference.
Amy, anything you want to add with the pastors you've worked with? What I've heard you share is you've run into at least one or two pastors that basically they've said out loud to their lay leaders, their elders, or the board, this is the church God's called me to lead, and I want that to be this church. But basically saying, if I can't lead this church to be this way, then I'm going to have to find the place that I can do that. I mean, you've heard leaders be that blunt. Is that true?
I have heard leaders be that blunt. And again, that's where that word courage comes back to, because it's a bold statement. It's also a very sad statement for them, because now they've put it out there out loud, and they just, I like, Gabe, the way that you said it. You have to lead in a place where you believe with the leadership, you share that heart mission of what you're called to do and what you're supposed to bring there. So, yeah.
All right, folks, it's been encouraging, as always, to engage this conversation with you. And by the way, we want it to be a conversation. And so the questions we did not get to, we'll do our best to respond to those in the coming days through the content we're providing. But let me just remind you, we don't want any church to be stuck. And as a result of that, first step is to figure out where are we stuck, why are we stuck? And so go to the unstuckchurch.com, where you can check out the assessment that I referred to, the book itself, and then our team's prepared. We want to be a part of your journey. We want to help you. We want to be on the ground with you, serving you. In the last month, we were in over 20 different churches on the ground, helping churches of all different sizes. We've helped churches under 200, churches over 20,000, and everywhere in between. I think you would be surprised at financially how doable it is, because we scale for different type churches. But we want to help your church get unstuck. And so if we can come alongside you to help you do that beyond the assessment resource, beyond the book resource, we want to do that. And let's begin that conversation today. We'll follow up in the email with a copy of today's webinar and the resources that I mentioned, and we'll look forward to you engaging with you again in the future. I appreciate you all. Have a great day.